All right. Is it good? Okay. All right, I guess we'll get started. Shh. All right. All right, so let's get started. It's that time. So this week is week 4. We're finally done with kind of the setup for the class, and now we're going to go right into the meat of the whole class, which is the commandments themselves. So this week we're going to hit the first commandment, which is probably the simplest commandment, but it sets the tone for all the rest. And we're going to spend the next 10 weeks here going over every commandment individually in detail for each week, and then we'll wrap up with putting it together in a how they pertain to government. So just kind of as a review, last 3 weeks we set up a solid framework. So now that we have a solid framework to study and understand the 10 Commandments, we saw that there are several types of morality that we should avoid, but yet they creep into our vocabulary and our everyday lives very commonly. It might be a little bit loud. So we looked at relativism, where there's no truth, but essentially what you make of it. And that had problems because it was just so nebulous. But we saw that it comes into our language when we say, oh, that was for them, or that was a command in the Old Testament and it no longer applies. And we don't understand why it doesn't apply anymore, but it was just for them. It was something they did then, and now we do something different without any understanding of why that is or if that's even true. So that kind of creeps into our language that way. Then we looked at utilitarianism, which is you're arguing based on the outcomes of your morality. And we see that that one is very common in today's life, and it's something we should avoid. That's not a good basis for morality itself. Then we looked at divine command theory, which sounds great. If it's just in the Bible, you simply do it. You read it and do it. And we saw that had some problems. Euthyphro's dilemma we went through. And in the process of solving that, we came to we found a good morality that fits the Bible's framework. And that was basing our morality on God's nature. So our imitation of God is what essentially makes us good. Our morality has God as the standard, and everything we do points to Him, and therefore every law that He makes reveals Himself to us in some ways. So then we saw that every law is going to, basically a framework that we're going to use to study every law comes down to this. So for every law, we're going to look at what the law says and what it means. So this is any expansions or modifications anywhere throughout the Bible that we're going to see. For example, where is the law restated and what else is said about it in that restatement, which leads to a lot of interesting additions. Examples of where and how the law is violated and what that can teach us. So a lot of times you're going to get a lot of instruction from how someone disobeyed the law and how God responded to that. And that will teach us a lot about the law itself. We're also going to look at, if we can find it, pre-law forms. So some of these laws we're going to see, they are, in fact, all the laws, but some of them have very explicit statements before the law is actually given to us, and those laws are still in effect. So we'll see that several times throughout the study. We're going to also look at apparent contradictions, or really any difficult or modifying passages and what those can teach us. So if some law says or don't do this, and then immediately says, hey, do this, and they contradict, we have to look at why that is and what we can learn from that. And sometimes those give us a much better and more full understanding of the commandment when you look at its contrast, its direct opposite in some way. So those are very helpful for us. Then we're going to see the law as a teacher. So for each law, we're going to look at what does this law teach us about God, what does the law teach us about us, and what does the law teach us about good and evil. And these are all three things that come from Galatians, where it says the law was a teacher to teach you about God, Christ, us, our relationship, and good and evil. And so directly, all from Scripture, each of these laws has something here to teach us. Then we're going to see the law in effect and practice. So how were these laws worked out, and what is their outcome? So sometimes they do have an intended outcome. Sometimes they have a blessing attached to them. Sometimes they have a practical outworking that we can just see naturally flows from them. Now, we looked at utilitarianism, and we found the conclusion of the outcome is not the basis of the morality. It's not the true objective, but a lot of times it's a good outcome, and it's a necessary outcome sometimes. And so we're going to look at those also, even though it's not the basis for our form of government, or form of morality, I should say. Then we're going to look at how is disobedience addressed and what, if any, punishments there are for the law. So sometimes, in fact, the whole second half of the commandment, we're going to see that there's laws, very specific laws attached to it, and very specific punishments for breaking those laws. And we're going to look at those also. Then for every law, we're going to look at applications. So not just for us, but in the Old Testament also. How was this law applied to Israel in the Old Testament? And then how is it applied to us in the New Testament? Are they different? Why are they different? And resolve those differences. And so that's how we're going to go forward. So just to kind of start the conversation here, you can turn to Exodus 20. And we're going to read the context and the full passage of the giving of the law. The actual story of the Ten Commandments. We're in the fourth week, and we're finally going to read the text. So Exodus 20, verses, we're going to read 1 through 21. And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath day of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt do not any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. And all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings, and the noise of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they were moved and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, for God is come to prove you, and that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not. And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where God was. Okay, so that's the entire story. That's the full passage of the Ten Commandments. So what do we see? The beginning starts with, I am the Lord. This fits perfectly into our morality like we saw last week. It flows naturally from the idea of God is the standard. I am the Lord, he says, and then he passes on a set of moral laws for us to follow. We also see that Moses is the intercessor here. So verses 19 through 21, the people say, we don't even want to talk to God. Moses, you do it for us. If you were in my other class, my class on the Messiah, you'd see that this is actually really important, and it becomes prophetic in the future, where Moses, in this way, is working as our intercessor between God and man, and then God later says that I will send someone like Moses in this specific way, and he will be your Messiah. And it's very interesting how Moses in the Old Testament pictures Christ better than anyone else. But in this class, that's just kind of a footnote. So we also see the full Ten Commandments, and they come in two divisions. So first is commands 1 through 5, and they basically represent our relationship and our duties toward God. And also commandments 6 through 10, which are relationships and our duties to men. Now, we often say that, or at least I've heard it said, that these are on the two different tablets, where the first 5 are on the first tablet, the last 5 are on the second tablet. I don't think that's technically true. If you just look at the volume of words, there's something like 240 words in the first 5 commandments and then 50 or so words in the last commandments. You'd have to have a really tiny tablet and a really big tablet. But that's neither here nor there. Just the point that there are 2 divisions, and they will work themselves out. Very interestingly, in fact, as we go through, we're going to see that the first 5 are categorically different from the last 5, but they're all effective as moral commandments for us, and they all apply to us in some way. But how they apply is the interesting part. Also, depending on what branch of Christianity you are, you're going to have different sets of these 10 commandments. So we read them all, and I'm sure every one of you recognized the 10 commandments, but if you're Catholic, or if you're coming from a Catholic background even, you might recognize them a little differently. Does anyone want to venture a guess what the 10 change if you're Catholic? Which one do they get rid of? The one about making idols. Reggie got it. Of course, Reggie got it. Yes, they lump the idolatry in with the first commandment. So their list goes like this: I am the Lord your God. You shall have no strange gods before me. That's the first commandment. Second one is you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. So they skip the second one, and what they have to do to make up the 10 is they go to the last one, which says you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, for number 9, and you shall not covet your neighbor's goods, for number 10. Now, it seems like a strange way to go about it, and it is. And they do it because they're Catholic, and they have a serious problem with idolatry. Next week, we're going to cover idolatry. It's one of my favorite classes, and they have a deep problem with this. And I think it kind of shows up in their scripture this way. So depending on... there are some other kind of sects of Christianity. I think Jehovah's Witnesses have something similar to us, but a little bit different. But most everyone agrees with us and how we see it. The Jews obviously agree with us in the way we see it. Everyone has the same lists except for a few offshoots. So we're going to go by the proper list, where the first one is I am the Lord your God. The second one is idolatry, and so on. So we're not going to be Catholic about it. All right, so let's just jump into the first commandment. Now that we've kind of set up the context a little bit, let's jump right in. So this is from Exodus 20, verses 3. Well, in fact, let's read 1 through 3. And the Lord and God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. So verse 3 is the command itself. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. So what does this teach us? So let's put it right into our framework. What does this teach us about God? So the first thing is he is the ultimate authority and sovereign. So not only is he the standard for our morality, which is very true, but he's the authority over us. So this is how we get the structure of morality. He's our standard, but it's also, we covered that last week, but it is also significant that God begins the 10 Commandments with, I am the Lord thy God, and I am the Lord thy God, not only as a standard, but also I did things for you. I led thee out of the land of Egypt. I brought thee out of the house of bondage. He brought an army of helpless slaves. He freed them from one of maybe the most powerful nation on earth at the time, which was both a display of his power and of his authority over both them and the Egyptians. Through Moses, he made the command to let his people go. The Egyptians said no, and God punished them for it. So he's displaying not only his raw power over the whole world, but his authority over the whole world, where if he makes a command of anyone, of any king anywhere, you must obey it, regardless of if you believe in him or not. Also, this teaches us that he wants a relationship with us. So it's not just that he is our God as a tyrant. He wants a real relationship to us in a much deeper way. In Deuteronomy 10, 12 through 15, we can read, And now, Israel, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee, but to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command thee this day for thy good. Behold, the heaven and the heaven of heavens is the Lord's thy God. The earth also, with all that therein is. Only the Lord had a delight in thy fathers to love them, and he chose their seed after them, even you above all the people, as it is this day. So it's not just a relationship of slavish worship to us. Some dishonest atheists, there are honest atheists out there who make better arguments, but a lot of atheists are just dishonest people who are bitter against God for some reason. And they often claim that our God is a sadistic tyrant who just wants an army of slaves to worship him, but that is genuinely not the case. He gives us familial relationship through Jesus upon our salvation, which we can read in John 3:1. Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. Therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not. So our relationship with God, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament that we could see, should be one of love. God loved us, and he gives us a special place in his heart. And he wants us to have a very special relationship, a very close relationship of father and children to him. You can see this everywhere in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, where he keeps saying, I love you, and I died for you, or I will die for you, I suppose. It's embedded deeply in the gospel message, but it's also true of the Old Testament. And a lot of people who don't understand the scripture, they look at the Old Testament and say, oh, that was the bad God. That was the God of hatred, and he was strict and he needed justice. And now the New Testament is the God of love, and it's very different, and that's not the case. The Old Testament was the same God as the New Testament. The commands are the same commands. God loved people in the Old Testament. He loves people in the New Testament, and he wants us to reciprocate that love and have a close relationship with him. And the law itself teaches us that. Also, the law teaches us that he deserves our worship. So this comes from verse 5. Thou shalt not bow that... So from the immediate context of this, God just miraculously delivered them from Egypt. And on verse 5, he says, Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, speaking of idols, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. So God doesn't just deserve our worship, he wants it. And he's jealous of it, in fact. If you start worshiping another God, which is obviously a sin from this commandment, he hates that. He becomes jealous of that. He wants your worship. He wants it in a loving relationship, but he does crave that worship. And he expects you to give it to him as part of this command. So that was an Old Testament passage. In a New Testament version, Revelation 4, 8 through 11 says, And the four beasts, so this is a prophetic passage, and the four beasts had each of them 6 wings about him, and they were full of eyes within, and they rest not day and night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come. And when those beasts give glory and honor and thanks to him that sat on the throne, who liveth forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him that sat on the throne, and worshipped him that liveth forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power. For thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. So God is not just jealous of our worship. He doesn't just want our worship. He is deserving of our worship in all things. Even the hosts of heaven will acknowledge this. Obviously heaven, if you're in heaven and you're doing a good thing, we should emulate that. Heaven, there's some interesting passages in Hebrews which shows that God desires heaven to be patterned here on earth. And he does that through the Old Testament in a lot of language of how he structures the temple and such. But I believe that's the same idea for us in the New Testament. If they are worshiping God in heaven, we should be worshiping God on earth. And they should be our examples for that. So he deserves our worship, he's jealous of our worship, and it is our duty to worship him. So let's see, what else does it teach us? So that was what it teaches us about God, but what does it teach us about us? What does this command itself teach us about us? First of all, we will worship a God, or we will worship something as a God. At any given time, we will only serve one of these gods properly also. So it's not that we can't have two gods. We can have two gods, but at any given time, you will be prioritizing one over the other. And God says, interestingly, God doesn't just say, he doesn't say prioritize me first. He says, no other gods, just have me. This contrasts to Matthew 6:24, which tells us that we can only serve one of two masters. No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. He cannot serve God and mammon. So if you are divided in your mind about trying to serve two masters, God says you can't do that. It is a sin to do that. I am the only God you should have. Don't even think about any others. So the idea is we will serve God in some way, some God of some type. Psalm 14:1 tells us that there's no option for serving no God, and that says, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they have done abominable works, there is none that doeth good. So this puts atheism in the category of foolishness. But more than that, even if you do honestly deny the existence of God and do not follow any religious practices, you genuinely do not believe there is a God, you are going to live your life for yourself or with some other goal in mind, some other goal that you've created or that you've discovered in some way. Effectively, you will be making yourself or that life goal your personal God, your very individually personal God, and that's a bad thing. So even if you deny the idea of a transcendent deity of some kind, you genuinely believe that the physical, material world is all there is, you will, by our very nature, set something up as your goal that you will pursue your whole life towards. And that goal can shift too. Sometimes it's, I'm going to live for myself. Sometimes it's, I'm going to live for my family, my children. Whatever the goal is, you will have something you are always working to. I genuinely don't believe there is a true nihilist out there. Everything you do needs a motivation of some kind. And every day, that motivation will be your God. Matthew 6:24, which we just read, tells us that money can be a god. And even though nobody genuinely holds up a dollar bill, sticks it on their mantle, and bows down and worships the dollar bill, no one actually believes that money is in any way a god. But Matthew 6:24 says that we do serve it like a god. And that's very obvious to a lot of people. You can see so many people, it's very common now. It's probably the most common god, honestly, in America, at least today, where everyone is searching for that dollar bill, and they sing songs about it, and they essentially worship it that way. But no one, if you asked even the most greedy person, is money divine? They would flat out tell you no. And they'd be honestly truthful in saying that. They don't believe it's a god, but they serve it as a god. So it's not just that you have to acknowledge something as divine for it to be your god. Your actions will show you what you serve as a god. Your actions will prove what is your god and how you serve it. And God says that's not good. But that is in our nature to do that. We will serve a god of some kind. And it's up to us what that god will be. And we can make a god of anything, no matter how mundane, and we will serve it. Just by the sheer force of our nature. Also, we will naturally resist serving God. So this is due to our sin nature. Obviously, before the fall, it was not so, but in our sinful nature, we will resist serving God. And this is very obvious to any of us if we're honest with ourselves, since we constantly put other things before God, even if it's just briefly, for a moment, this one thing that's distracting me from serving God, that in that moment becomes your God, or at least you serve it as your God. The Bible is replete with examples of this throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the Old Testament, especially when dealing with the Israelites, since that's what it focuses on. There are too many to name, too many to list anyway, but at least I would say the quintessential example of this happens right away here in Exodus 20, or actually Exodus 32. So turn to Exodus 32. It's a retelling of the story, or at least it's the second half of the story, and I think it's pretty interesting. So at the very moment that God is giving these commands to Moses, something is happening down in the field with the Israelites. So let's read Exodus 32, verses 1 through 8, and then we'll skip down to 15. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. And Aaron said unto them, Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, of your sons, and of your daughters, and bring them unto me. And by the way, Moses was only gone for 40 days. It's like just a little over a month, and they're already picking up a new god. Verse 3, And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graven tool after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early on the morrow, and offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and to drink, and rose up to play. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go get thee down, for thy people which thou broughtest up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I have commanded them, and they have made them a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. All right, before we skip to verse 15, let's just kind of note this. Right away, they immediately discarded everything that just happened and made this golden calf. It seems so bizarre. Like at the moment, they're looking up at a mountain covered in flaming smoke and fire, and they're already like, no. So if you think that you, in your own power, could resist moving against other God, moving towards other gods, just think of these Israelites. They had every reason to stick with it, to stay there and serve God. In some point on this passage, he says, if anyone touches the mountain, they're going to die. So they had very physical evidence of the power of God at their very fingertips, and they even still walked away and went against him with other gods. So we obviously can't do this by our own power. We are naturally inclined to these things. All right, so now let's go to verse 15. Let's read through 29. And Moses turned and went down from the mount, and the two tables of the testimony were in his hand. The tables were written on both of their sides. On the one side and on the other were they written. And the tables were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, graven upon the tables. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, There is a noise of war in the camp. And he said, It is not the voice of them that shout for mastery, neither is it for the voice of them that cry for being overcome, but the noise of them that sing do I hear. And it came to pass, as soon as he came nigh upon the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tables out of his hands, and brake them beneath the mount. And he took the calf which they had made, and burnt it in the fire, and ground it to powder, and strawed it upon the water, and made the children of Israel to drink it. He made them drink their God. I love that part. This is actually the intro slides that I have, where God's holding up the tablets, whatever you would call them. That's where I get this image from, and I just love this picture where he grinds their God down, puts it in the water, and makes them eat their God. It's pretty based. And Moses said unto Aaron, What did this people unto thee, that thou hast brought so great a sin upon them? And Aaron said, Let not the anger of my Lord wax hot. Thou knowest the people, that they are set to mischief. For they said unto me, Make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. And I said unto them, Whosoever hath any gold, blah, blah, blah. And it goes on. Let's go to verse 27. And he said unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Put every man his sword by his side, and go in and out from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. There are severe consequences for disobeying God. Verse 28, And the children of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. For Moses had said, Consecrate yourselves today to the Lord, even every man upon his son and upon his brother, that he may bestow upon you a blessing to this day. All right, so here we see that in the very moment that God is carving the first commandment into stone, Aaron is carving the golden calf to replace him. It's pretty awful if you think about it that way. This violates the first and the second commandments. Next week we're going to get into the second commandment. But generally these two commandments go together. There is a reason the Catholics do merge them. There is a huge amount of overlap because generally when in the Old Testament, when someone goes for another god, it's with an idol. Not so much today. But anyway, very importantly then in verse 29, we see that the remedy of the sin was for the people to turn back to God and consecrate themselves and their families again to him. So they were punished for their evil deeds. 3,000 people were killed. And the remedy then was reconsecrate yourself to God. Abandon your gods and come back to me. So there is always a path back, thankfully. So there are many examples of this throughout the Old Testament. This happens repeatedly. And for example, the kings of Israel. Here's another example that's actually pretty interesting. The kings of Israel in Deuteronomy 17:17 were commanded to not have many wives, specifically because their many wives will turn their hearts away from God. So Deuteronomy 17:17 says, neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away, neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. So then guess what the third king does? King Solomon multiplies and then adds some more, and then multiplies a little more, and ends up with 1,000 wives, or 700 wives and 300 concubines. And guess what happens? They turn his heart away from God, just like he said they would. And it's not surprising, but this is naturally what happens to us. So these examples show us that not only is it natural for us to depart from God, but breaking other commands will help us do so. It's also very interesting that you see this first commandment is tightly intertwined with lots of other commandments. We'll see that throughout all these commandments. Murder is intertwined with this, which is intertwined with this, and they all link together very nicely. So speeding right along, what does this teach us about good and evil? So the first commandment, what does it teach us about good and evil? Sin is inherently and primarily anti-God. So the first step in sinning is to set God aside and to put some other desire or goal in his place, obviously. Galatians 5:16 says, this I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. So if you're filled with the Spirit, God's Spirit, obviously, you will not sin. You will not fulfill the lust of the flesh. This is the idea. The opposite must be true then. If you are not filled with the Spirit, you are prone to sin. This also teaches us that sin does not apply only to humanity, and this is interesting. So in Isaiah 14, we read this passage, which is pretty interesting. Isaiah 14:12-15. You can turn there if you'd like. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. So this is interesting. Sin doesn't just apply to humans either. And it doesn't just apply after the command is made. This was made, we don't really know when this happened. It was sometime before Adam's fall. So while the earth was still perfect and sinless, Satan was sinning. It was essentially the first sin. And it was a violation of the first commandment, where Satan wanted to put himself in place of God. It was fundamentally a rejection of God and an attempt to usurp his position in heaven. It manifested itself as pride in this case, which is a sin that is very closely tied with this commandment. If you are setting God aside, you naturally must replace him with something. And what better place to get that something than from you? So it manifests itself as pride very often. If you see pride in your life, you should probably look at the first commandment again and ask yourself, am I still having God in his proper place? Is he in the proper hierarchy, if you will? So rushing right along, the first commandment, how it applies, applications and outcomes. So what are some practical outcomes if we follow this commandment? First of all, piety and godliness. So a fear of God and a respect for God. So first of all, we will fear God. The mighty God that delivered the Israelites out of Egypt with a mighty hand deserves our respect and reverence. So obviously this has a lot of overlap with the first principles we looked at, where God desires our worship, he deserves our worship. We should therefore give him our worship. So practical outcome, a way to apply this, to do this, is to worship God. And how do we worship God? Well, right here, you're doing it. It's very easy to see it in church, where this is the primary way this is the only way. As a group, we do worship. You can worship him individually in your own life, and you must do that all throughout the week. But in church, it's a very special time. It's a very distinct time. It's also a command we'll see later, much later in the class. The fear of God should also help us avoid sin, and that is an inherent part of this commandment. In Exodus 20:20 says, "And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, for God has come to prove you, and that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not." So this is right here in the context of the Ten Commandments. If you fear God, you will not sin, or at least the fear of God will help you to not sin. So if you are practicing this first commandment, if you're fearing God, you're giving him due reverence, if you're putting him first in your life, you will avoid sin. That is inherent in this. That's a perfectly normal outcome. This is repeated in Matthew 22. Do I have time for that? Yeah. In Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40, this kind of ties the first and the fifth commandment together. The Pharisees asked Jesus, what is the primary commandment? And this is the discussion about that. But when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, and saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the laws and the prophets. So Jesus is saying it's impossible to overestimate this command. This is the primary command that with the fifth commandment contained the entirety of the laws and the prophets. It's an answer to a tempting question, so there's a lot of like Jewish baggage that hangs around in that. But essentially, it is not possible to overestimate the significance of this command. It establishes the basis and authority for all of the commands going forward. So, if you obey this, you will naturally be pious and godly. We will also find, if you obey this, you will have a natural rejection of heresy and false teaching. So this is not just a rejection of other gods, but a rejection of the perversions of the doctrine of the true God. Since to love God, we must know him. To know him, we must study him and his word, since his word reveals him to us, which naturally leads us to a knowledge of and a love for the sound teaching of his word, and should lead to a rejection and a hatred for false teaching about God, which we are commanded to serve and love. So the simple fact of if you love someone, so if there was just someone in Timbuktu who you loved, you would probably call them up. You'd probably look into them. You'd probably find out about them, learn what they like, what they don't like. It's the same thing with us, with God. If you truly love God, you'll obey his commandments. To obey his commandments, you must know his commandments. To know his commandments, you must know doctrine. And you will naturally learn more and more about him. You will love him more and more. And when you see false statements about him, you will hate those. If you heard false things about your wife or your husband, you would hate those things. That is natural, and that is good, and that is a direct outcome of this commandment. So if we obey the first commandment, if we have God first, we will reject false teaching. This also establishes a proper hierarchy for us. So of the hierarchy goes God, man, and then everything else. And where God fits in that should be right at the top. So we were created to be like God. We discussed this last week a lot. And we were also created to have dominion over everything from Genesis 1:26. But we are also lesser creatures than God. Obviously, we don't believe that we are God. We are simply in his image. That doesn't make us God. That does make us like God, however. Before the fall, it was obviously natural for man to serve God and to be with him. But sin ruined our relationship with God, and now we must be constantly reminded to put God first. So before the fall, there are passages which say that God and man walked hand in hand in the garden in the evenings. And so after the fall, that's not the case. We no longer walk with God. We no longer see God physically. So we need this reminder to constantly keep him in his proper place. We must keep in mind the hierarchy of authority comes directly from here. God, us, everything else. Also, if you follow this commandment to its logical conclusion, you will have salvation. And this comes from Hosea 13:4, which is a very interesting passage. It's a restatement of the first commandment in some ways. I'll read verses 1 through 4, Hosea 13. When Ephraim spake trembling, he exalted himself in Israel. But when he offended in Baal, he died. And now they sin more and more, and have made them molten images of their silver, and idols according to their own understanding, all of it the work of craftsmen. They say of them, let the men that sacrifice kiss the calves. Therefore they shall be as the morning cloud, and as the early dew that passeth away, as the chaff that is driven with the whirlwind out of the floor, and as the smoke out of the chimney. Yet I am the Lord thy God from the land of Egypt, and thou shalt know no God but me, for there is no Savior beside me. So even in the Old Testament, this language of salvation, of Savior, of being saved through God, is present there. And it comes right after this restatement of the first commandment. I find it very interesting. It should be understood that salvation is a command, therefore, and not just a gift. A natural, good, and direct outcome of following the first commandment is ultimately your salvation. All right, so how do we do this? First of all, love God. That's the clearest, most direct way of doing this. You can look up those verses later. I don't have time. I went through my time too fast or too slowly. But we saw this in Deuteronomy 10:12, where God says that he wants a relationship of love between him and his people. This is repeated somewhat in the New Testament, Matthew 22:34, where he says, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. It's a direct quote. So Jesus is reestablishing the same command. We will also serve God to apply this. So this is clear throughout the Old Testament. The Jews are constantly told to serve God, and told to serve God, and they don't do it very well. In the New Testament, we're given the same type of command. You can see that in Romans 12:1. We are also commanded to walk in the Spirit. So this is from Galatians 5:16. We already read this. Walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lusts of the flesh. And then from 5:24 and 25, and they that are Christ's have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. So this is very simple, very direct, very broad ways of applying this command. Love God, serve God, and walk in the Spirit daily. So that wraps up the first commandment. Next week we're going to do idolatry. So if we have that handout, we'll pass those out to everyone. You're going to get this handout. Oh, I messed up. So this is just to prep your mind for the next commandment. We're looking at idolatry. Let's test our critical thinking skills about this one. So you're going to get this command, this question. Which of these, if any, was not an idol? So you're going to have these four options. Brass bowls, golden calf, the brass serpent, that's Moses, by the way, and Mary in a bathtub. So I want you to circle the one that is not an idol, if any. If they're all idols, obviously don't circle anything, but just think about this. I'll give you kind of a hint. All of these things are found in the Bible. Obviously not Mary in a bathtub, but Mary's found in the Bible. You can find all these examples in the Bible. So if you want to hunt for them to find the answers, you can. And just think about that for next week. And I think you're going to find the answer very interesting next week. So any questions?